He's one of the most important coffee personas in the world today. He has a very pragmatic point of view on the current state and the future of specialty coffee industry. He's held a number of executive positions over the last 25 years in various different specialty coffee and tea companies, including being the director at World Coffee Research or World Coffee Events. I was lucky to see a number of Ric's presentations and talks at RICO conferences in the United States, and what always impressed me the most was his ability to connect economic data, business insight with knowledge and experience. So, ladies and gentlemen, please big applause and welcome to the stage, Mr. Ric Rhinehart.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very much appreciated. Thank you all. Wow, the chances of me living up to that billing are somewhere between slim and none. So lower your expectations. First off, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our gracious host for inviting me here, particularly given my last performance here 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't think I was ever going to get invited back. I was that uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner that you... But nonetheless, thank you so much for being so gracious as to have me back. It is a pleasure, and I want to give a shout out to all the casually dressed people out there who are PROBAT staff. Undoubtedly, you did a ton to get ready for this. It's a great event. And this is maybe one of those days where you'd rather be doing your real job than the job you have to do today. I imagine it's hard to have everybody in your space, but at the same time, you should be very, very proud of what you've done here, and you've made us feel very welcome. And again, I thank you. So I got asked to talk here, and the theme of this conference was connecting markets, and I thought a little bit about that. And then I thought, how am I going to be the after-lunch speaker? And I thought, let me give the driest, most boring possible topic I can come up with, and I'll talk about that. So here's what I thought of that you wouldn't possibly want to hear about, and most of you will probably fall asleep, and is differentiating quality in a two-tier market. And that's a tease. I'm not actually going to talk about that, except I'm sort of going to talk about it, but not really. So you'll have to connect lots of dots to get to that place, but let's see how it goes. So what I really want to talk about is avocados. I don't actually really want to talk about avocados. What I want to talk about is how we're processing information and taking on positions and what our perspectives are, and what it all means in a world of incredibly dynamic and rapid change. Things are changing around us at an incredible pace. And so this slide that I put up here, this is a couple years old, but I love this advice from a very wealthy real estate guy who told the millennial generation, the incoming generation, if you would stop eating so many avocados, you could buy a house. You could take out avocados and say, if you stop buying all those fancy coffees, you could buy a car. And millennials, to their great credit, basically looked at him and said, we don't want cars. And which, not sure Uber was exactly what the whole world was thinking about abandoning cars, but it's true. It's a very different perspective. And I put this up here for two reasons. One is I want to talk about the perspective of how important avocados are in your life as to how important a car or some other thing might be in your life. And I also want to talk about the concept of rich old white dudes telling people how to do shit, because it's just probably not where we want our future to go. So, what do we know about these millennials that are getting this sage advice from a real estate investor? There aren't any real estate, I don't mean like you bought a house and you live in it and maybe you saved some money and bought a second house. I mean, there aren't any real estate investors like guys with real estate trusts of $1 billion they're managing or huge portfolios. None of you are in the room, right? Okay. We're all coffee people, so I figured none of us really can invest in real estate in a significant way. I hate real estate investors. So, but I like millennials. So I think a lot about millennials because, as I mentioned here, it's time for my generation, and I sort of explained a little bit. I am a baby boomer, so I was born in that period after World War II and before all the crazy stuff. So that period in there, that moment of sort of calm is when a bunch of us were born. In the United States, it was 90 million of us. We were the largest consuming cohort of all time in the US. And those numbers are more or less the same, not in absolute numbers, but in scale in Western Europe and Japan. So there's a giant bubble, demographic bubble in those post-war years. And so we've sort of had our hands on the wheel for, it seems like forever, right? But we've sort of been driving this world and this economy politically and economically from a business perspective, from thought perspectives and lots of other things. We've been around a long time. We've gotten a lot of things wrong. One of the things that's interesting to my generation is our deep, deep concern about the generation that's going to replace us. And for those of you who are in the intermediate generation, the Gen Xers, I'm not talking about you because you're not actually going to replace us. As I like to tell all the Gen Xers out there, you're going to be in charge for about 10 seconds because we're not letting go. We're holding on as tight as we can. And there is the new largest demographic bubble in history, which vastly surpasses my generational bubble, those millennials and Gen Z combo. They're hot on your heels, and they're not very interested in you or anything you have to say. So you get to be in charge, you Gen Xers. I think it starts right after my talk, and it's over just before the second coffee break. So that's it. So enjoy it while you got it. So I'm interested in what millennials do and think and how they behave and what they're going to do with the remnants of this world that we've left them. So I try to understand this, and here's what I've learned. I learned that millennials are eating up all their savings by dining out too much. I also learned that millennials are destroying the restaurant business by eating at home too much. So the data's clear that nobody knows what they're talking about. And so to me, so the takeaway here is that data, which is powerful stuff, is utterly meaningless unless you've got good analysis, right? So data means nothing. It's just all those sheets and I hear you, that you wrote all those temperatures every 30 seconds without the time, energy, inclination, and capacity to do that analysis. It means nothing. It's just data. Now, if you can do the analysis and you do it well, it's powerful stuff. So here's the current analysis. We're pretty sure millennials don't eat. It's not actually good analysis. There's a different analysis. And what I really, this is a tweet for, I know that word. This is a tweet about do millennials even eat food, basis of these big contradictions in the data and the analysis of it. But then an actual millennial weighs in and gets to the heart of the matter. This is the analytic piece here that got missed by all of the baby boomers who were trying to analyze the data they had about millennials eating out too much and millennials not eating out enough and the impacts on society. Millennial weighs in and says, hey, maybe it's neither of those things. Maybe what you're seeing is the flailing of a failing economic system. And that got the room quiet for a second there. Let me talk a little bit about that. I was in Switzerland at the Swiss Coffee Trade Association dinner last year, which for those of you who go, it's a great event. For those of you who've never been, it is exactly what you think. All the masters of the universe get together and they plot the course for coffee for the next year, and then they go out and do it, and you guys are subject to what they plot. That's not really what happens. It's just a bunch of people getting together trying to figure out how to do business in a rapidly changing environment. But a young person, a actual dyed-in-the-wool millennial, walked up to me at that event, and he said, Rick, why do you hate capitalism? And I looked at him and I thought, dude, I was born in the United States in the mid-20th century, have been in business all my life, and I run a trade association today, which in the end of the day, there's nothing more capitalist than a trade association because it's a collection of capitalists who get together to figure out how to advance capitalism for their businesses, and they get a tax-free status for that. That's capitalism at its very finest. So I don't hate capitalism. I love capitalism, sort of. I think capitalism is a compelling economic system. I think it's a really, really horrific ethical system. And when we get to the place where we conflate capitalism as an economic premise with capitalism as an ethical premise, we get into real trouble. So if you are a Milton Friedman fan who decided that the business of business is business, and it has no business in anything else, you're embracing business as your ethical system, because there are things apart from business. Margaret Thatcher once famously said, "There is no society," as she made her run for economic prosperity with trickle-down economics. Well, I beg to differ. I'm looking at some society right here. It's a diverse and interesting and engaging society, and this is society. We exist. And things are happening in our society that are going to inform how we're going to exercise our economic system of capitalism, and we have to think about those things. Here's an interesting thing. The US, the country I'm from, has the most income polarized economy in the developed world amongst the medium to high income countries. The most polarized. I'm going to say that one more time. The United States, a group of people who, for whatever reason, have long prided themselves on the egalitarian nature of our society, live in the most economically polarized society in the developed world. And this is not just self-flagellation. Weighing in at a very close second, Sweden. Any Swedes in the room? Not a Swede here? You all stayed home to count your kroners or whatever they are? I always thought of Sweden as an incredibly egalitarian society, highly polarized. And even here in Germany, a place that, again, I would have thought had a much more, in the US, the part of our press in the US talks about you socialists over here and how terrible you are in taking away everybody's wealth and distributing it. And yet Germany also has a very highly polarized distribution. What does this mean? Well, the meaning is very clear in practical terms. A lot of wealth, a tremendous amount of wealth, is concentrated in the hands of very, very few people. That's sort of the literal meaning of this. That is, the disparity between the poor and the wealthy is high, and one of the ways that gets higher is you push down the middle. So as the middle class shrinks, you push pressure down on the middle class, they squirt out either end. And a few lucky ones go up to the wealthy, and most of the others go down into the poor. And that's what's happening in our economic universe today. And it's not me telling you this. I am telling you this, but I didn't make this stuff up, and it's not my data. This is real world data. It's largely inarguable as data. The analysis of how it's happening and why it's happening and what it means to us is something that everybody can explore. But as data, this is a truth. So we can agree to have different opinions about this, but we have to agree on the same facts, and these are some facts. Now we can talk about some opinions. What are the implications of all this? Here it is, by the way. There we are. That's kind of terrifying to think that we have that much income disparity in places that we think of as relatively egalitarian. I don't know how Indonesia snuck in there. It came out of this Alliance report, but there it lives. Apparently also a lot of income inequality there. But what does that mean to us from a practical standpoint, and why did I call my talk today Differentiating on Quality in a Two-Tier Market? Well, this is a little slide. This is from a guy who's a economics professor at the Kellogg School at Northwestern University in Chicago. And I just absolutely robbed him of this slide. And I have him credited in the bottom of the slide, but I'm so poor at preparing these things that I cut off that. So the little dots, those of you who have done hallucinogenic drugs can actually read that bottom line, because you only need 10% of the actual typeface to be able to read it. But it's a credit to the professor, Rogério, who's a Portuguese-born professor of economics based in the US. And he gave a presentation, and I snapped a picture of this slide. So this is really a transfer of a picture from my phone, because I was so fascinated by this. And it's a look about the implications of the change in income distribution on how people shop. All right? So what you see here is a representation. This is a very US-focused representation, but it's becoming applicable in more parts of the developed world. And you're seeing this, what we thought of as the fat part of the middle of markets, that place where, for many of us, when we went out to buy things, we looked for some equilibrium between price and value. So I want to get something, I don't have to have the very best thing because I know I can't afford that. And I'm not willing to take the least expensive version of this. What I want to look for is that intersection of price and value, where what I'm getting represents a good value for the price I'm paying for it when it's compared to the other things in its class. As you push down on the middle class, you start to push that supply and demand curve. You start to push that consumer purchasing habit out to the edges. And what you see is polarization, demand polarization, a preference for consumers for luxury items and a counterbalancing preference for by consumers for very low-cost items, and more turmoil and less security and more challenges to operating in the middle where you get these equilibrium or near equilibrium conditions between price and value. And so if you grew up with a big branding company over the last 30 years, you operated on the concept that the place where the activity really is in that fat part of the middle, where people are making purchasing decisions based on finding equilibrium between price and value. But that reality is changing. And it's changing in part because of this concentration of wealth. There's more wealthy people, and the wealthy people have more of the wealth, and they're more inclined to spend it over here on the really expensive side. And there's more poor people or struggling lower middle class people, and they're more inclined to spend their money over here on the things I can afford because I have to have them, but I can only pay this much for them. And the stuff in the middle is suffering. And this is a little representation of some things. You see that in the shopping world, you've got Walmart over there, the low-cost provider, activity's high there. Whole Foods representing the luxury provider, doing very well. In the hotel class there, you have Days Inn, the low-cost provider over there, and then you've got Four Seasons, the luxury class. So their markets are doing well. And he provided a bunch of data, again, US-based, that looks at a whole range of different categories. Restaurants are a good example in the US. The very low-cost providers in the restaurant business are thriving. The Michelin-starred side of the business is actually doing quite well. But the family dining segment, the stuff in the middle, is in turmoil, having a hard time making ends meet and attracting and maintaining customers. This is demand polarization, and demand polarization is a result of income polarization. It happens. And one of the things we want to take a look at is what I referenced in the title. What happens in a two-tier market like this? So here's one of the things that happens. This kind of demand polarization forces value and relevance to become very, very personal. So for those of you who are in the specialty coffee business, so Tim, when you look at your customers, you're able to capture a certain segment of customers. Undoubtedly, you get some customers because they're commodity buyers. They need caffeine. They need a place to stop. They need a glass of water with their cup of coffee. They need a moment to talk. They have a whole host of reasons to use your space. But the customers who are your repeat customers, who are your core customers, who are traveling to you as a destination, they're there for personal reasons because the value perception that they have of your coffee has as much to do with their personal outlook on coffee as it does with the absolute intrinsic quality of your product. And so income polarization drives demand polarization, and demand polarization drives this outcome. Value and relevance become very important. What does that mean as a practical matter? I assume none of this has been very practical to you guys so far. This is my attempt to show this to you graphically, and I'm really bad at doing that, so I'm going to talk about it instead. But it's there as a reference point. When we talk about the personal and the relevance nature of these things, what's really happening here is that products in our world today divide themselves more and more along two lines: things that have a high emotional context for us, and things that have a low emotional context. So we can generally think of commodities as things with low emotional context. Corn, maize, cotton, petroleum. I don't know if any of you are like hugely brand loyal for one particular type of diesel fuel, but it seems unlikely. It doesn't have a huge emotional context. Other things, food, wine, music, these things have enormous emotional context. And when we look at those things, and we look at what happens in this demand polarization, the consumer, captive in demand polarization, out to buy diesel fuel, is looking for the lowest price, period. There's no emotional context. So the value equation is how cheap can I get something that I know is unadulterated. That's it. In music or food, that same consumer is saying, hey, where can I get the thing that connects me personally with the deep emotional context for my food? I should take a moment to note that I had a conversation yesterday with somebody about, and you've heard a million of these, there's only two kinds of people in the world, right? And then you get to say what they are. So I'm going to exercise my moment of privilege here to tell you that in my belief system, there's only two kinds of people in the world. There are people who eat to live, and there are people who live to eat. And anybody who knows me at all knows where I'm on the I live to eat. It should be obvious, and if you've been around me at all, you got to know I live to eat. But there are people who eat to live. There are people who literally could not care less. If they could get away without eating, they'd just stop, right? I don't know any of those people because I don't allow them into my personal circle of intimacy, because I don't like those people. They're worse than real estate investors. That's not true. It's just a thing. If you are a person who lives to eat, let's go out and get a drink or something to eat or just enjoy our lives together. If you're a person who eats to live, I feel terribly for you because you're missing one of life's fundamental joys. But in any event, food for most of us, and certainly for all of those of us who live to eat, falls into that high emotional context. So it changes our behavior, right? High emotion products, we want to be personalized and we want to push the quality up to maximize the emotional benefit of our interaction with them. And if you think about that behavior, the way it plays out in our increasingly demand polarized society is that my 26-year-old son, this is an N of one and it's an anecdote, it's not data, but it's an illustrative case. My 26-year-old son will cook every meal at home and shop at a discounter to get the ingredients for 3 weeks, and then he'll go out to dinner at some place and he'll blow $175 on dinner with his girlfriend because it's a very high emotional context for him, and he wants to move it over into the luxury product. He wants to personalize it, he wants to drive the quality up, and he's willing to spend it, and he is a millennial. The most demand polarized segment of American society today. Lots of debt, not so much earning power. Very, very, very much polarized off to the margins. All right, so this has profound implications for all kinds of products. Any product that you guys want to talk about? We can talk about this one. So we did some research we started about 6 or 7 years ago, and the incredibly brilliant Tracy Ging, who is the chairman of the board for World Coffee Research, and just a fascinating marketer, initiated this research to try to understand something about specialty coffee and how coffee drinkers perceive coffee. And we learned a bunch of things qualitatively and a few things quantitatively, but the qualitative stuff we learned was amazing. And what we learned most of all is that consumers have a deep emotional connection to coffee. It's a range of emotional context, but it's a deep emotional connection to coffee most of the time. Now, I walked in here this morning after being graciously transported here by a gentleman who works here, who's he's a buyer here, I guess. He's an engineer in the purchasing department, if you will. Super nice guy. Drove us here. We got out, and I had the pleasure of running into Mr. Abbing, and I said, Vim, thank you for having us here. Any chance we could get a cup of coffee? And at that moment, while I had a substantial emotional connection to coffee, my principal emotional connection was to caffeine. I needed to get some caffeine. And so coffee drinkers, while coffee has an emotional context in our lives, and we can talk a little bit more about that overarching statement, but at different parts of the day and different conditions, we have different kinds of emotional context for coffee. So all of us are just people who need caffeine. I say all of us just presuming that all of you are coffee drinkers here. I could be wrong. Usually there are pod people out there in the coffee audience who don't drink coffee, and we're not going to try to unmask you or anything. But for everyone to go along with the idea that we all really want a cup of coffee that first thing in the morning. So we're caffeine contextualized here. The emotional condition for us is I need caffeine. But it's still a high emotional, if you need caffeine and you don't have any caffeine, that's high emotional context. But in general, coffee consumers have high emotional context for coffee apart from the caffeine need. The experience of coffee is where we drive that emotion. And if you want to test this concept, just think about the actual product that we're all in the business of working with, coffee. This is a non-nutritive food crop that occupies a tremendous space in our agricultural undertakings. That is a big economic driver for us, and it has no food value to speak of, right? We can't live on it. We can't live without it, but we can't live on it. It's a mild psychotropic, but it's, if you're in the business of sort of getting a jolt, there's way better ways to do it than coffee, for sure. So, that's really not the driver for it. I love coffee and I'm fascinated by the flavor palette of coffee, but I'm here to tell you that coffee doesn't actually intrinsically taste good to human beings. It's full of things that are designed to tell us that it's potentially toxic and we should stay away from it. And if you doubt that, give your young child a sip of coffee sometime and watch the reaction on their face. Or if you're a pregnant woman, there's probably a trimester in there where the idea of coffee is so appalling to you that you walk away from it. And that's nature's way of telling us, hey, that's this caffeine thing, we got to manage that. But it's not intrinsically good tasting. It's an acculturated thing. We develop a taste for coffee. We like how it smells mostly. Most of us like the smell of coffee, but almost none of us natively like the taste of coffee. We learn to love coffee, and if we develop a certain connoisseurship, we really get excited about it, and our emotional connection to it increases. But it is emotional. Our context for coffee is emotional. So what does that tell us about how we're going to sell coffee and where we're going to sell coffee? Well, it tells us a couple of things. It tells us that if you're selling coffee to your highly engaged, emotionally connected customer and telling them this coffee was grown at 1,700 meters above sea level, it's the Bourbon variety, and it's got these flavors and acidity in it, and you can tell them all the details, the data behind it, and it's probably not going to connect the drinker to the cup very effectively. It does have another impact, though, which is interesting. It's likely to connect the drinker to you. And that's something else we learned in our research, is that coffee drinkers, most coffee drinkers, even though coffee has high emotional context for them, and even though it's interesting to them, it's not as interesting to them as it is to you, but they're fascinated by you folks out there in the specialty coffee world who are deeply engaged with coffee, and they like that. And that makes them connected to your business. So that's one of the ways we sell specialty coffee. Not just on the intrinsic quality of the product, not just the quality of that cup, nor the quality of the coffee beans that preceded that cup, nor even the quality of the roasting, but the totality of the experience, including how you engaged with them. Specialty coffee is special because people are involved in specialty coffee. That high emotional context is what matters. And so it begs this question for those of you who are not in specialty coffee, and I recognize that A, many of you are not in specialty coffee, and B, even people in specialty coffee are also not in specialty coffee, at least to the degree if I'm a farmer and I'm producing coffee, there are no specialty coffee farmers in the world. There are just coffee farmers, and the best of them produce the best and luckiest and most advantaged of them produce some specialty coffee, and some commercial grade coffee, and some bad coffee, but nobody produces all specialty coffee. So let's put that thought out of our minds. But it drives this paradox. Who am I going to sell to? Where do I live in this world of income polarization and demand polarization and a changing generational demographic that has a whole new outlook on what they want to spend their money on and when they want to spend it and what they hope to get out of that spending, where are you going to be? And somebody asked the question this morning about how will brands fare in this future? And brands are out there, but you've got a generation that's generally suspicious of brands, that has a computer in their pockets or hands all the time and can fact check you every time your brand opens its brand mouth, and in emotionally contextualized products is looking for a personal choice, and a brand is whatever the opposite of a personal choice is, unless you make your brand, and this is I'm going to pander to our hosts right now, unless you make your brand a personal appeal to every one of your customers. And I would say that my data analysis suggests to me that one of the reasons that PROBAT has been here for 150 years is that by and large you have successfully made your product personalized for each and every customer. And that is a fantastic thing. And that has made the brand strong. And it suggests that's the future of brands that want to survive in this increasingly polarized economy, that you have to personalize your brand. Or you can abandon that and you can commodify your brand and you can compete at the low-cost producer end. And that's a reasonable and viable place to compete. It's tough down there. It's not a lot of fun, but it's a big, fat, growing marketplace. So it turns out that I'm the executive director of the Specialty Coffee Association. So I should probably talk a little bit about specialty coffee here. And there's been a lot of definitions of specialty coffee over the years. None of them are sufficient. I'm not enamored of any of them. This one is not mine. It's not the SCA's. This is a definition of specialty coffee that a very bright Ethiopian woman crafted. And I have stolen this from her. Well, actually, I haven't stolen it. I just borrowed it. I'm not going to take it away or anything. It's just out there. But we can think of specialty coffee as a coffee that's defined by its origin and that it has a value premium, that it's worth more than not specialty coffee, which is an interesting definition. It's a way of saying this thing's more valuable because it's more valuable. But that's not the whole truth. I mean, the truth is that specialty coffee is already a personal, contextualized choice for people. And we can do lots to sort of move people towards specialty coffee, but all of that is really moving people towards better coffee, and the target is forever changing. Has anybody in this room had the best cup of coffee they're ever going to have for the rest of their life? I haven't, and I hope I can keep saying that for a long time, because every year I have another cup of coffee that surpasses the best cup of coffee I'd ever had up till then. So specialty coffee is this continuum. It's moving there. Why do you care about this? Well, in part because you're in the coffee business, and specialty coffee has been leading the growth of the coffee business for more than 2 decades now. Partly because that idea of a value premium is important to us for a couple of reasons. It's important just intrinsically. We like coffee to be a valuable thing. It's the business we're in. And the other thing is that value is a reflection, if things are going the way we like them to go, of price. So the higher the value, ostensibly the higher the price. And why do we care about a high price? Well, here's one of the reasons. You heard someone, Hans, I think, alluded to this morning. This is sort of squishy, generalized data from the ICO about where coffee is produced in the world. And as you can see, top 5 producers there. They make the lion's share of the coffee. I've shown people this slide a lot. Looks something like this. 1996, 57% of the exportable coffee in the world produced, this is export coffee, by the way, not total production. 57% of the exportable quality coffee in 1996 produced by 5 countries, 67% in 2006, and last year, or 2 years ago, 74% of the exportable coffee was produced in just 5 countries. If we're going to talk about specialty coffee, we're going to talk about differentiation. That is what specialty coffee is about. A higher value coffee because it has a higher emotional context and because it's intrinsically better than the other coffee around it. This suggests that we may have some problems in differentiation. So what's the future? What does all this mean to us? Well, first, there's this idea of differentiated product quality. We want coffee from a lot of origins that is intrinsically better, of higher quality than other coffees. We need that sort of source material. And we need to be sure that we have that. And one of the ways that we need to be sure that we have that is we need to make sure that we're making enough investment in the future of that coffee in light of this changing dynamic of climate change and a polarized economy and all the other things out there that are changing so fast around us. And that means investment in that product quality. And that investment, I have to tell you, is very challenging to make for a coffee farmer in light of current market prices. You, as a coffee drinker, have the opportunity to make that investment in lots of ways. One is you can buy better coffee, whether in the cup or in whole bean or in raw green material. You can buy better coffee. You can make it other ways. Tim Schilling from World Coffee Research is here. You can join his checkoff funding program, and you can invest in the future of coffee by carving out 1 cent per pound, 1 cent per pound. In the current market, 1% of your cost of coffee. In fact, you can do it at 0.5 cent if you must, at 0.5% of your cost could go to World Coffee Research and fund the research that allows us to differentiate on product quality into the future, that extends the lifespan and market participation of those coffee producing countries that are below the top 5, so that someday you can get countries you didn't see in that top 5 like Kenya, Guatemala, Costa Rica, so you can keep buying those coffees into the future. The other thing you can do is understand that coffee has high emotional context and has the opportunity to be a very personally tailored experience. And this is fundamentally the promise of specialty coffee, and it's inextricably linked to that idea of differentiated product quality, to deliver a better tasting beverage in a more enjoyable experience with a higher level of personal connectivity, with a higher emotional context, which generates greater value. And it generates greater value for old dudes like me, but it really, really generates greater value and in fact trips a decision for the incoming generation. It is a principal decision driver. Is this experience tailored to me? Coffee is highly emotional. And we're in a fundamentally manufacturing, engineering, and software creation firm, which in general is perhaps the least emotional set of things that one can imagine. And yet we're here, and I just had lunch with lots of people that I know and who I like. I had coffee with people that I haven't seen in a while and got a chance to connect with them. And the thing that really brought us together, besides celebrating our friends' 150th anniversary, is this coffee thing. We know each other because of coffee, and it has high emotional context for us. And so the key for the future of coffee is understanding this high emotional context. I'm going to take a minute to bring you down a little bit, if you're not already down, about the importance of this emotional context, because our emotions around coffee today and in many days are very, very positive ones. We're happy to share a cup of coffee with each other, to see each other over a cup of coffee. We take joy in drinking this fabulous thing. The aroma of great coffee drives us. We like the experience of safety and warmth and connection in a coffee house. And we like the act of grinding our own coffee and making a cup of it in our own homes. These are all emotional contexts that we value, and they're good, positive emotional things. But right now there are millions, literally millions of people for whom the emotional context of coffee is completely negative, because they are, for reasons beyond their own comprehension largely, being whipsawed around in a highly volatile commodity marketplace that is tied to the utterly emotionless world of trading coffee as a commodity. And the last time that any kind of decent coffee gets treated without any emotion is at that point of trade. Because once it goes out to the person you intend to consume it, it is imbued with emotion. And we got to remember that. We got to remember that our goal is to deliver that same positive emotional context to everybody in the value chain, not just the consumer, not just those of us in front of the customer in a cafe, not just the roaster, not just the lucky buyer of coffee who gets to discover and taste these fantastic coffees, not just the roaster who takes pride in the great job she did in roasting that coffee, not just in those national organizations that have to foster their communities, but all the way down to the farmer, to the farm laborer. They deserve to have positive emotional context for coffee as well. Every one of these factors is necessary for the consumer, and every one of these factors ultimately is necessary for everyone in the value chain. So I'm going to leave you with this. You got the question on the last panel, how do you feel about the future of coffee? Do you fear for coffee? Are you afraid for coffee? And the answer is no, I shouldn't be afraid for coffee. But you should be concerned about coffee. You should be thoughtful about coffee. And my ask for you today is to gain some new perspective, to recontextualize your engagement with coffee. Let the barriers down a little bit. Be a little bit emotional. Fall in love with coffee again. Share some love in coffee again. Take some joy in coffee again. And be inspired to deliver some joy to somebody else in coffee. Somebody who needs a cup of coffee, or somebody who needs to make a living on the little parcel of land they have, or anybody in between. Take that emotional context. Deliver it to your business, however unemotional it might be. Make every customer interaction a deeply personal interaction. And that will guarantee for us the future of specialty coffee. Thank you.